Hey Arlene, how are you?
I'm great. Great to talk to you.
I'm so happy to connect with you. And you're here in New York. You're not in Russia or in anywhere else. You're here in the city.
That's right. I'm downtown.
So I saw that you wrote a book. It's called Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and and Politics. And I was like, oh, I have to read this. I need this. And I read the foreword or the introduction, and you said something that just caught me. You said, I'm writing this book as an outsider. And I thought, wow, that gives you so much leverage, so much power. Can you tell me a little bit about what drove you to write this book?
Absolutely. As an outsider, I meant that you may know I'm a professor, tenured, full professor. So some of us work in academia have something called tenured, and that means job security, which means we can say pretty much anything.
Fantastic.
We
Congratulations.
right? Scholarship. And I have been kind of a participant in the kind of Latinx art world in New York City. Zillion years ago, I started my career at an institution that no longer exists, but it was very important for our community, called the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art,
Mm,
which was the first museum really focusing on contemporary Latinx art, which back then the word was Hispanic. But and I also worked at Museo del Barrio briefly. So I've always had like one foot in the kind of art world, but really my career has been in academia. And from this perspective, I have been able to observe changes in the art world and how it treats Latinx artists, Puerto Rican artists. And I've always been concerned. So these are when the opportunity presented, more than the opportunity, like the past couple of years, you may have seen that there's kind of a resurgence. You know, what I talk about is a Latinx activist movement, where more artists, curators began to kind of organize around the call for representation. I felt that I was a participant in that kind of conversation, but I felt that my role that I had a particular role to play. Particularly because I was not an insider in that I don't depend, my livelihood does not depend on making a living in the art world.
sure. What do you teach at NYU?
Teach at NYU, I'm in the anthropology and American studies, but that's another conversation about how you thread both disciplinary and interdisciplinary boundaries. But I don't have to depend on gigs or curatorial, which are, as you know, very unstable type of works, right? Artists oftentimes feel like they can say some things because if not, they're not going to get. There's just kind of polite silence around matters of race and matters of inequality and matters of the market in the art.
It froze a little bit. Can you hear me? There we are. It froze a little bit. Okay, so we're good. Okay, so you were telling me of matters de
It's
algo.
polite,
So
right? It's
I'm
polite.
yeah. So in doing this book, did you was it easy for you in just going back in your experiences, or did you feel you had to kind of take the pulse of where things are right now?
Um, I was inspired in this Latinx activist movement, as I described. Colleagues of mine, friends of mine were organizing. You may have heard about the U.S. Latinx Art Forum, where art historians organized because there was no Latinx art in the College Art Association. So there are colleagues, friends that I've known. So I was part of those meetings. Then there is a very important U.S. Latinx Art Futures Symposium organized at the Ford Foundation by Teresita Fernandez, which was so important. This was back in 2016, I believe, or 17. And it was so important because what she did was bring this conversation to the national level, inviting artists from the West Coast, from all over the United States to discuss things. And I talked about this in the book, I think in the acknowledgments, about how to me it was eye-opening to see that a lot of the issues that I have heard from artists in New York City were echoed and repeated by artists all over the United States that were part of that symposium. So that was kind of like my aha moment that, oh, well, I have to write this book because, as I said, particularly at that meeting, I was one of the speakers, and I realized that I was the only person talking about issues of the market, which seemed to be like kind of the elephant in the room.
Big time. Yeah.
That kind of guides so much of the conversation, but it's never really talked about openly.
Now, you started writing this book. The panorama has changed. What do you think are some of the takeaways that are in your book that can prepare us for what's happening post-COVID? Because we really do have an opportunity to kind of create a new paradigm, right? And what does that look like?
Absolutely. I think that the issues of that we're seeing more and more is greater awareness of the fact that that the contemporary art world is a space where issues of equity and social justice need to be discussed and played out. It's an important forum. It's an important space. It's not an apolitical space. And especially, particularly issues of visibility and representation in the art world, in cultural economies, in cultural industries. The issues that I discuss in relationship to the contemporary art world are so akin to the battles of representation in journalism, in museums at large, in academia, in the film industry, in the publishing industry, right? So this is kind of an issue where more than ever we're seeing culture matters, visibility matters, and this is not only an issue of empowerment, but there are also issues of cultural equity around economic empowerment, because we have to realize that the cultural industries are such important industries. There are so many millions of dollars that are being circulated in these industries where we're talking about people's jobs, right? The value of people's works. There's so many levels that it's not only a matter of visibility and representation, but it's also a matter of equity, social justice, and general empowerment to address issues of racism in the arts.
Yeah, I mean, on a very superficial level, I think contemporary art also really sets the visual trend, right, for fashion, for magazines, for these little conversations that happen. And it really worries me. So I'm a collage artist. I subscribe to 100 magazines. One of them being Town and Country, which is, like the most, White Lily magazine you can subscribe. But the cover and everything in it right now is African American faces. And I'm thinking, this feels wrong, right? Because there's no bridge. It's kind of just like, okay, let's slap this. Let's get this going. Let's get the look. How do you think we can build authentic bridges? These real relationships where it isn't just beholden on the conversations that look good, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where issues of the economy are so important, which are kinds of the issues that as an anthropologist, right, I've always been very interested, not only in this book, but I've kind of been around the block, in looking at Hispanic marketing or urban studies, other spaces where you have battles of representation. And the kind of questions I ask is, let's go beyond the look, right? Let's go beyond what I've called elsewhere the kind of Latino spin, right? The kind of like the look off, or that has historically been used to kind of whitewash so many projects. That's another conversation. But this notion that, it's not enough to appear, right? We're in a moment of real accountability. And we have to really have conversations about who is producing those representations, who benefits from those representations, who's involved in those circulations, right? And basically who's profiting ultimately from this, right? And that's kind of the key element, because and that requires structural transformation in our industries, because otherwise you're going to have this kind of like color of the month emergency of diversity.
Absolutely. And that's what it is, right?
Exacto, where you're going to see like all of a sudden, oh, well, now we have to have more name, no, we need to really transform these industries so that they look like the real demographics of the United States, so that they look like the real demographics of cities like New York City. That's really, right, that structural conversation of real change that is lasting, that it is not color of the month, but that is continuous and that is able to produce diverse representations, not kind of like emergency representations, but that rather that you see real diverse, because as you know, Latinx populations, hello, it's not a race, it's an ethnicity, it's a conglomerate, it's a pan-ethnic group. So you need to have, our Black Latinx people, you have to have our indigenous Latinx people, you need to have, um, disabled folk, you need to have older, all kinds of things that right now we don't have, and we are unable to produce when we have this kind of emergency. Oh, well, we need to have an author now. We need to have a Latino writer now. And
that seems like a lot of work.
Well, that's why you need to change these industries to ensure that their makeup of their staff, right? It's totally, right now there's a whole debate, I'm sure you've been following, around the Los Angeles Times, and now we basically said, hey, there's no writers. Los Angeles is a city that's Latino, and there's really no writers, very few. How do you change in New York City? New York Times does not even go there. But, or the New Yorker, this kind of like foundational magazines and foundational, I'm referring back here to the recent editorial by Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, and Monica Ramirez about these kinds of issues of lack of representation that go back to, that go back to who's been hired in our journalist and writer and publishing. But, in academia, I'm one of the few Puerto Rican academics, but also how many Latinx scholars. There's so many departments at NYU and elsewhere that do not have any Black faculty, don't have Latinx faculty. So anyways, I could ramble forever, but it goes back to, it's not a lot of work, Luis, if you have industries and institutions that look the way they should in the makeup of their staffs.
Well,
right?
what I'm wondering is, there's so much work to be done that I'm wondering, should we just start from scratch, right? Should Latinos start their own papers, their own media companies, and do they have that agency and equity to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. If we go back to the context of the art world, which I talk about in the Latinx art book, that's one issue that kind of runs through, is the need for Latinx artists to become more empowered. And I bring examples when that has happened, and the importance of, because you're right, it's not like there's a lot of curators out there that know about our artists. There's also not a lot of institutions that are attuned and that have the knowledge to know where to find us, because there is that historical gap. So how do you begin to change when there's so much work to do, going back to your question? And I think it's so important that artists realize the importance of empowering themselves, of organizing around collectives, or showing each other's work. I think social media has done great job that way too, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people are not waiting for artists and creators to know about their work, but they're actually self-promoting themselves and also self-promoting other artists. I talk about many examples of collaborations between artists that I think are great, especially when you don't have enough curators out there. A lot of artists are functioning as curators, as dealers, as representatives.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've seen that, right?
Well, going back to what you were saying, that there's this elephant in the room and everyone's very hush-hush about the obvious problems. It's like, if you're an artist trained academically, how do you empower yourself when you're trained to not talk about these issues, right? So I've come across so many self-taught artists, and they're doing so well because they were not trained to have these mores or these limitations that we kind of self-impose, right? Which is, again, why I'm so excited to speak to you, because, like you said, you're an outsider. You have a totally different lens as an anthropologist. How did that help you to frame it from a point of view of an anthropologist?
Well, I think I talk about this kind of taboos of how you create value in the art world, this idea. I have, as an anthropologist and who has written about issues of value, as a culturally constructed thing, that is not something that is not sacred, unlike what art historians would tell you. I have always come from that perspective, right? So I don't buy into this idea that there is such a thing as quality and merit that is just out there. And I think that I come from that perspective that kind of challenges against the kind of Kool-Aid, if you will, right? That a lot of these institutions are so Eurocentric at the core. And a lot of the foundations of the thinking, particularly this idea right? That there's a distinction between the economic realm and the cultural realm, and that you cannot mess them up, that they're antagonistic. Forget that more and more elites and collectors and money shape the conversation around aesthetic value. Not only today, but always, right? So I think it's important to demystify a lot of the Kool-Aids that are taught that have to do with the Eurocentric understandings of value and art that are also very racially imbued, because, they are meant, right? If you think about that notion of like the antagonistic notion of value between culture and the economics, it's meant to like not highlight that the people that are very wealthy will always do better, but we can talk about that, right? Because it is the distinction. So all those, I actually make, and I don't know if this makes any sense in the book, I explain it much better, but I make a comparison between this taboo against talking about market with the taboo against talking about how racism impacts the conversation of value. And I argue that both of them work in tandem, right? So nobody's supposed to talk about how much racism impacts the fact that it's white artists that have historically done better, just like the conversation around economics and culture doesn't allow us to highlight how much the economics, right, and the muscle of elite and patronage have also impacted the conversation of value. As a result, value is a constructed quality that is also very imbued, and we need to be very savvy and not buy into those Kool-Aids, and always fight against those ideas, right?
Absolutely. I remember right before COVID hit, it was Art Week, and I went to all these art fairs, and I got updates on my phone. Oh, they're closing this, they're closing the airports, whatever. But these paintings were going for $34,000 a pop, and it's this, and in my head I'm like, oh my god, the world is ending, and this made-up economy, it's made up. Like, it means not, like, this is literally just a piece of fabric on the wall, and we're making it up, right? So again, how do we get our community to also partake in this made up value, right? Because I think it's really hard for people to kind of give it that value. So one thing that I've noticed a lot is like you'll find leather goods per se, and you find it in Mexico for $30, and you're like, oh, can I get it for 25? But you get a leather good here in New York or in the U.S. and it's $300, and that's acceptable because it's made by a white hand. Right? It's not. It wasn't made indigenously or whatever. So it's this idea that we really do buy into. We, like you said, we drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a big conversation right now going around artists getting more empowerment about selling their work, for instance, right? Ensuring that they have control over the resale value. The issue of resale royalties is so important. It is not acceptable that we live in an economy whereby it's only collectors who benefit from any value of the work, because once an artist sells the work, they don't have any ability to control and benefit from any kind of evaluation of that work.
Sure.
So you get those. You mentioned the example of the $30,000 painting. Who knows what the artist was paid? Rest assured that the artist is not getting any of whatever money is accrued on that work. Only the collectors and the people that sell that work.
Right.
So there's a conversation right now where these issues are coming out more and more. Look what happened now with the Whitney exhibition, right?
The one that didn't happen?
That exhibition, where a lot of the work was, obtained, very cheaply, and artists are like, hey, that's not fair. So we have to also be very critical, and I'm also a little critical about the fundraising, all of this fundraising model where artists, right, are not benefiting from their work. So all those conversations are way overdue, and it goes back to how do we change the art economy to ensure not only that more of us get involved, selling our work, becoming Latinx dealers, Latinx galleries, also selling our own work, but also developing new ways of doing businesses and of running things to ensure that our artists and the community benefits, that there's not this kind of speculation, that it doesn't further the speculation that is marginalizing artists.
Yeah, I think that's very important. It's also, I think it's such a weird time to have these conversations because there's so many other pressing matters that you're like, well, why am I talking about this? Because like the world, like I said, this world is end. Let me talk about this. But then artists are literally starving, by
Exactly.
it's crazy. Yeah, it's really nuts.
And I think ultimately, with my own humble thing, what I hope this book does is that it gets conversations like that, with the hope that we could have more of our creative workers, right? Artists who are creative workers,
Yeah.
not only the artists who produce the work and their brilliance recognized for their brilliance, but also their labor, their work, their rights
Yeah.
as members of a larger creative class, right? There's so many, we tend to think of like this, I know, very narrow idea of a contemporary artist who works in their studio and makes a living out of their works. Very few artists actually make a living that way.
Correct.
Most artists, as you know, have other jobs, part-time, multiple gigs. So whenever you raise issues of empowerment, equity, rights around healthcare, education, anything that has to do with equity helps not only the general economy, but helps our artists, because most artists and creative class are also people, are humans, are workers. They're doing a lot of other things. So it's important to challenge this idea of like, oh, well, this book is about artists and, it's like high class, high end. No, because most of us, at least many of the artists I work with, were having all kinds of jobs to
Yeah,
survive.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the Latinx experience is a very we're united here in the U.S. and that's what makes it Latinx, correct? That we're all coming here and having this experience. I also question, we all want to be here because it's New York, because here's where the money is. But in thinking about the elections and thinking about the current environment, I'm thinking, where the heck am I going to go if he wins? I'm thinking, I have a few layers of protection, right? Like you mentioned the creative class. As creatives, you go into different countries or different territories, you're viewed completely different. I would even go as far as saying you're respected in a way because you have a point of view, you have a practice, you have a dialogue you want to, you can participate in. Right? That doesn't necessarily exist here. Do you think the art conversation here is only market driven?
We've got to change that, right? We've got to challenge that. I like to think that a lot of the Latinx artists that I've met, that are that I see in Instagram, that are exhibiting, that I interviewed for the book, are many of them are activists. Many of them are like working in communities, and they're developing new narratives of how the world should be, that are empowering, that are challenging
Amazing.
racism, opening up ideas of citizenship, and that are broader about humanity. And I think that I wrote the book ultimately because I always tell myself that I like artists more than oftentimes I can appreciate artwork, because
Absolutely.
I'm not not visually trained. As a kind of like art historian would look at a piece, or not. Let's not fetishize art historians, but my appreciation of artists is not only about their work, but it's also about the incredible worldviews. And I don't want to also fetishize artists as being always like that's another conversation going on, right? Artists, like have this extra sense, like no. But those that inspire me do, and that's what we like to learn, right? From many of them. So I like to think that no, the problem is that we do live in a huge neoliberal city that is ruled by elites and millionaires, and has really diminished the conversation about what's valuable and who can run a business in the city, who can even live in the city. So we have to change that conversation, and hopefully that could be one of the opportunities of this COVID post world, is that we live in a world where all of us are, where notions of equity and opportunity are really at the forefront of any conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's all coming together really weirdly, but it's all coming together. Can you talk to me a little bit about your writing practice? How did that start?
I don't have a writing practice at all. I like to think of myself as a kind of binge writer. Like I would not, like I do with sweets or anything, like ice cream, the idea that like sometimes you have nothing to say, like I sometimes read these ideas of people that wake up in the morning and read and write every day. And like, I'm like, why? Who does that? I write when I have something to say. And when I do, and I'm getting very inspired, I get totally obsessed, and I'm like, I go into that zone, and then I will write something really fast, really quickly, and furiously. But then I won't write for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months, for 4 months, whatever. So in my experience, I've written books really quickly, in terms of the research to the book. But within that, there is always the actual writing is much shorter and furious. I would like to say it's like boom. But I'm not a disciplined writer, and I think people need to find what works, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also different when you're writing from an academic point of view, right? To some extent, you kind of have an audience that's looking for your voice, opposed to just being a creative writer who's writing a novel and needs to find that audience, I would think, right? Or am I wrong?
I am so not a creative writer. I have no idea how people come up with stories like that. I draw stories from what people tell me. Like this is like, I'm just, like a document. And then I analyze a little bit, and I try to, I pride myself in not being jargony. So anybody who hasn't looked at the book, I promise you is, I'm very clear. I don't think academic writing should be inaccessible. So I try to be very accessible, because I'm writing not only for academic audiences. I couldn't care less. I'm writing for my larger communities, and for people who are interested in matters of equity, in the museum world, in the art world at large. And ultimately, I'm writing to address issues of visibility. I hope that people, whether they like the book or hate the book or use Latinx or don't use Latinx or whatever it is, I hope the book provides a space of conversation, right? That somebody else can continue, as opposed to like, oh, who are Latinos? What Latinx art? Like, I hope that the book helps further that conversation a little bit, so that more conversations can open up, right? And that's kind of like the what we author, at least from my perspective, what I try to do with books. I don't claim to have ever the definite source on this topic at all. I'm hoping that the book helps a lot of people who are trying to carve a space for appreciating Latinx art in its complexity. I'm hoping the book will help those further the conversation, right? I would be very happy that if the book helps.
Can you tell me an experience, perhaps when you first started your career, that really kind of moved you as far as experiencing art and meeting artists? What was that like?
God, I guess so many, right? But I think like the first would be when I was, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and in a countryside. So there, the first was artisans, right? Artesanos, right? Which we tend to like not appreciate, but fascinating to see actually, by the way, when you interview a lot of our contemporary artists. It's very interesting how many of them will say that they don't have any artist in their family, but then you carve a little bit more and they'll say, oh, well, my tia was a seamstress.
Wow, right.
Or my mother was, did such and such, or, you know that, right? In our community,
Amazing.
There's a lot of that other, like handicrafts or artisans or sewing or, so I think that also is art, right? How could not be? So to me, in Puerto Rico, having access to artesanos, wood carvers, that kind of, that was perhaps, my first.
And did you have any artesanos in your family?
No, not at all.
Carve a little? You might have.
My mom is a good example. She was into, sewing, she did macrame, she did knitting, she even painted. My goodness, all of all kinds of things. That's not only I don't have any of that art, artisanal perspective, but huge appreciation. And it's interesting now to see how many contemporary artists are also drawing on,
Yeah,
right, old
craft. Yeah,
traditions,
absolutely.
crafts. That's always been, and I love to see so many artists that are doing and are drawing from, and that are embroidering their work and so forth.
Let me ask you: do you consider yourself an activist?
Absolutely. Why would I be in academia otherwise?
Ah.
I think most I think, Luis, that most ethnic studies scholars and Latinx studies scholars are by default activists because there's no other way to be in academia otherwise and do this work if you did not have a footing, an appreciation on larger social struggles for justice and equity that we fight, in academia every day.
And how do you cope with that? I know a lot of people who are in your position, and I've heard stories, and I know it's not easy. How do you cope with that? How do you have the strength to write a book about it and not let it be doom and gloom?
Well, I think, and I have to say, many of the Latinx scholars that I have spoken feel this way, which is because academia is such a hostile and white-centered space. A lot of us channel a lot of our writings. Our writing becomes it fuels our research, it fuels our intellectual agenda, because otherwise you couldn't survive in these spaces. So I'm not rare. I would generalize that most of my colleagues that work in ethnic studies are doing the same. They use a lot of their angst. They channel it to their research or to their mentorship of students, right? Or to opening up spaces in academia by teaching courses. That kind of is the most rewarding element because when you see the difference we can make in the classroom and in these white spaces, teaching a class on Latinx studies, teaching a class on these topics, it matters.
Yeah.
And that's a huge source of inspiration.
I love that you point that out. That how could you not, right? There's that meme that's going around that says, if you're not angry right now, you're not paying attention, right? And I feel that this kind of experience that you're describing in your book and academia kind of translates in all Latino endeavors, right? Anything that people want to do, you're always going to be faced by this opposition. So in some way, you either, assimilate, you become an activist, and you find a way to do it, right?
Absolutely. And I think all of us can do something. Oftentimes people think, activist has this kind of like big word and narrowed understanding, but it's this really appreciation that we're all working together and we're all doing a little bit, right? And how do we respect and uplift each other's voices?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's really important too, to work to really have alliances so I appreciate your invitation today.
Thank you for chatting with me. And before I let you go, take me to a happy place. So let's say 10 years from now, the world has read this and has taken their cues. What does that look like? What does the space look like? A good space where we have equity in your eyes 10 years after Latinx art, the book.
Wow. Well, you would have people will read the book and will say, "Oh my God, that book is so passé." Right? I'm like, "Oh my God, that sounds like none of that applies today."
Wow.
Imagine that, right? That would be a dream that people read that book and they'll be like, "Oh my God, they would not think it's relevant because the conversation is so advanced." That our artists are everywhere and are part of every exhibition. And you wouldn't even need a label like Latinx art, maybe, because we are all over, and we are, right, represented everywhere. And the other key element is that this is not about an issue of Latinx empowerment. This is an issue of the empowerment of all people of color, right? Black and brown, indigenous. That's the world where we Latinx people will benefit. That would be best for us, because then you really have a world, right, where racial inequality and racial, is not an issue, and that nobody is being left out of the conversation because of their background or race. So that's kind of what it looks like.
I love that. You win, I win. That's brilliant. Arlene, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I know you're very busy. Congratulations on your book, and I look forward to talking to you 10 years from now, and yeah, having it be so passe.
How about you, Louis? Sorry to turn the convo to you. 10 years from now, how about you? What does the
Ooh.
world look like? What would Louis be doing 10 years from now?
Oh goodness. So secretly I'd have an artist compound. And my dream is to give residencies to artists, like a huge stipend. Here's, $1,000 a month. Live, create, collaborate. Um, because it just I hope that there's a more dynamic way where it doesn't have to be like charity because I'm so against charity. I really hope there's a way that we can kind of figure out how not to do that. But I feel like right now, as things are, I would really want to create a program where artists don't have to struggle in here, because I'm always questioning New York as the center of the art world, right? How the heck are artists supposed to create amazing work when they're under so much pressure, right? I think everyone took a sigh of relief when they're like, "What? I can't leave my house for a month?" Okay, you know.
Yeah,
So that's my dream.
yeah. Well, I would love to help you with that. It's a fabulous dream. So let's plan ahead.
Let's do it early. Well,
Yes.
here's to us, and you have a great day.
Thank you so much. Now let me
See, yeah.